Hello and welcome to the programme that brings together leading commentators in the UK with the correspondents who write, broadcast and blog for audiences back home from the Dateline London. Just one topic for us this week: how 20 years of commitment to Afghanistan dissolved in a matter of days, and what the consequences may be for the people of Afghanistan, its neighbours and the rest of the world. Joining us for Dateline, Janet Daly, columnist with the Sunday Telegraph, Michael Goldfarb, host of the podcast The First Rough Draft of History, and here with me in the studio, The Guardian's China editor, Vincent Nee. Welcome to all of you. It's good to have you with us. Janet, let's begin with what this means, if we can, a little bit for the UK. Boris Johnson has been trying to develop an independent foreign policy. We know it's been pretty clear that this was not a decision that the British particularly wanted to take at this moment. What does this and what is happening in Afghanistan tell us about Britain's influence in Washington, its military capability and its ability to adopt a leadership role, do you think?
Well, it's not at all surprising that the foreign policies of the UK and the US should be diverging, because they're the principal members of NATO. And NATO has been in an existential crisis ever since the Cold War ended. It was devised, if we all remember, as an adversary to the Soviet bloc and the communist bloc. And when communism collapsed and there was no more Soviet Union to oppose, the obvious question is, what is NATO for? And within 10 years of communism collapsing, we had 9/11 and the rise of Islamist terrorism. And so NATO became basically a counter-terrorism outfit. And that was its impetus, that was its raison d'etre. So that's why Biden can say the reason that we were able to pull out of Afghanistan, that we wanted to pull out of Afghanistan, was that we felt we had solved the terrorism problem in Afghanistan. We killed bin Laden, we got rid of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and so if we could get out, that's got nothing almost to do with the original conception of NATO, which was to act not only as a military adversary, but as an ideological adversary to the Soviet Union. And now we seem to be in this peculiar vacuum where there's an entirely new global dynamic, and it's not ideological at all. It's really crudely nationalist. The motives of China and Russia and Iran now, it's not that bloc that is developing that dynamic, which will involve Afghanistan very heavily, I fear, is not the old ideological argument about how should people live, should we have a communist society or a capitalist society? It's much more to do with the emerging totalitarian empires, particularly China, which is really totalitarian capitalism. It's not really a communist society at all. And if NATO is to survive, and if the kind of cooperation that we've had between the UK and the US and the other European allies is to survive, it's going to have to come to terms with this entirely new global political dynamic.
Michael, George Robertson, who was NATO Secretary General back at the start of the century, and who was the man who effectively convened the meeting that said we're going in because one country has been threatened, a NATO member, the US, by the attacks on 9/11, so we're all threatened, so we all join in. He said he thinks the decision by America now has undermined the organisation and raises real question marks about its credibility and about the alliance. Given what Janet was saying there, we are now entering, are we not, a much more dangerous phase in which there isn't a straightforward division, and we can't guarantee or rely on the people we thought we could rely on. Michael.
Oh, that was for me. I thought. This is the problem with not being in the studio.
We're going to get you back as soon as the people in charge tell us we can have you back for COVID reasons, but I hope it's going to be very soon.
Good. It's interesting you bring up George Robertson. I mean, I think of George Robertson as being someone from the glory days of the Anglo-American duopoly. But the thing is, during the Blair administration, the thing is that I can remember back and covering this in the early 1990s when former Yugoslavia was falling apart and Bosnia was in agony. The ability to marshal NATO and the UN into crisp action on European soil was really hard. It was like, herding cats, to use a cliche. And now this is something slightly different. I would say that, the reality of this adventure was that the U.S. used NATO and Article 5 was invoked and all of that. But really, it was mostly the U.S., a little Britain. And, I can remember doing stories about how Germany had been assigned to some part of Afghanistan where there was likely to be absolutely no fighting, because Germany has very, very strong reservations about out-of-area action for historical reasons. Those historical reasons ended 75 years ago. They may have to reconsider in the rest of this century. And so what you have to take on board with this is that NATO it's a multinational, multilateral organization, but really it's two or three major European powers in the United States. And on Afghanistan, let's be very, very clear. The U.S. spent roughly $2 trillion over the last 20 years in the Afghanistan adventure. The United Kingdom spent about upwards of 80 billion. Now, if you do that ratio in a commercial situation, 80 billion to 2 trillion, as a stockholder, you're not going to get a seat on the board. NATO was a convenient umbrella, but this has always been a United States venture. And frankly, watching some of the scenes in Parliament this week, I'm amazed that so many people, particularly on the conservative backbenches, forgot that basic fact, that when you put all that money and all those lives into an adventure, basically you're calling the shots. And it doesn't matter whether you call yourself a NATO adventure or not. This is basically a United States adventure.
Vincent Nee, let's talk a bit more about Afghanistan itself. The question that many will ask, how quickly the government melted away, how quickly the military melted away. I mean, Joe Biden, again, Friday evening, his address to the nation was using this phrase, I think he actually had there were 300 Afghan soldiers. There were 300,000, but actually there were 300,000 people being paid. Nobody actually thinks there were 300,000 because a lot of this was money that was corruptly diverted. But however many soldiers there were, that all vanished very quickly. Why was the Afghan government so apparently unloved in Afghanistan?
Well, sure. I guess, this is the question that everyone's asking. Everyone's doing soul searching on, why this government collapses so quickly after 20 years of being backed by the United States. And this is really, really the question that is also going to come back to haunt Joe Biden in the years to come. And I think, when it comes to running of the government, the Afghan government doesn't really have a good reputation for being effective, being clean. And this week, there were pictures of Ashraf Ghani's nephew, posing in Dubai, in all these luxurious lifestyles. These are really examples of how these governments failed. Going back to Michael and Jenny were talking about, the UK and the US, I think this shouldn't come as a surprise. Joe Biden won the American presidency under the promise that his foreign policy will be benefiting American middle class. So his calculation is, if our troops no longer benefit the US or not directly benefiting American middle class, so why don't we just go out entirely?
And there are no votes in the Afghan war.
Absolutely, and also he has to think about the legacies. He doesn't want to be the president who is associated with the so-called perpetual war in Afghanistan.
Let's talk about, continue on the American theme, if we may, Michael. Biden, in a sense, he decided on Friday to hit back and hit back hard. So we had this thing about no superpower other than America who possibly projects so much power that it can secure an airport hundreds of thousands of miles away and get people home. Well, that's still an ongoing. We'll see what securing the airport amounts to and whether that merely is the Taliban choosing not to attack. But in whatever the practicalities of that, he's clearly trying to say this is a demonstration of American power. And to some extent, he's right, isn't he, that the threat to the American homeland that came from Afghanistan has gone. Al-Qaeda is a much diminished force. And actually, if America looks at the places where terrorism could become a threat, there are other places, particularly, obviously, the Middle East and North Africa.
Exactly. And one of the most interesting things that's sort of bubbling up from people who study terrorism and have been doing since, well, for 20 years, since 9/11, is to note today that there have been ISIS groups, ISIS franchises criticizing the Taliban for not winning in Afghanistan. No, they didn't win by jihad. It was handed to them on a plate by the United States, who simply withdrew. They didn't earn their victory. And there's a sense that at some point, to the degree that ISIS has any presence in Afghanistan, that's something that the Taliban may have to deal with in the future. No, what's happened over the last 20 years, Al-Qaeda was driven into the mountains between Afghanistan and Pakistan very quickly. It was a very quick military victory. People forget that. Then I don't think any historian, even 500 years from now, will say that if the George Bush administration had not pursued the Al-Qaeda remnants into the Tora Bora caves and found Osama bin Laden and completed the mission in December 2001, instead of starting to withdraw troops and start to build up to invade Iraq, that the whole story that we're talking about tonight would have been very, very different. And while there's been all this focus and concentration on Afghanistan and a lot of, troops tied down, a lot of money tied down, the franchises of ISIS, Al-Qaeda, have grown, metastasized. I mean, ISIS grew out of the Iraq occupation from people who were imprisoned by the Americans in Iraq. Now they're across Central Africa. They're in the Horn of Africa. And, they are also, let's not forget, for the most part, they are no longer operating on American or European soil. So another thing for Americans and Europeans to forget. Unfortunately, if you live in those countries, northern parts of Nigeria, for example, you can't forget that, because they are a part of your daily life. They are a danger to you every single day.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned that. It's a very good point. Janet, just on some of these broader questions that got caught up in the aftermath of the Afghan invasion, there was an interesting quote from Joe Biden, in which he said the idea that we are able to deal with the rights of women, this was earlier in the week when he was being interviewed, around the world by military force is not rational. But without that military presence in Afghanistan, does America have any potential leverage over the regime that will be left there, the Taliban?
Probably not. But I mean, American policy on this has been incoherent for a long time. When Obama was first elected, he said Iraq was the wrong war, but Afghanistan was the right war, so we'll persevere with the war in Afghanistan and pull out of Iraq.
Oh, Janet's frozen. Janet, I will come back to you. Vincent, let me ask you, does this play into China's hands at all? Because China is just about a neighbour of Afghanistan. There's a little bit of the Wuhan corridor, isn't it?
Yes, there's a very small border shared with Afghanistan. I think, well, if we come into this question with this mindset of a great power competition, which is, America's loss is definitely China's gain, then probably yes. But I'm afraid the reality is much more complex.
Yes.
If anything, China is very, very nervous about it. Right?
Yes.
China thinks Afghanistan is a quagmire, and they look at history being Afghanistan's neighbor for a long time. In the 19th century and the early 20th century, it was Britain, and then 20th century it was the Soviet Union, and now the 21st century is the United States. So Chinese state media are calling Afghanistan the graveyard of empires. So you can see how China actually thinks of this issue. It's not necessarily America's loss, definitely China's.
No, it's interesting. Afghanistan proved that the British Empire as a concept was, it could no longer project power in a way it had so comfortably and confidently for a couple of centuries or more. You can certainly say that about how humiliating it was, Janet, for the Soviet Union after it had to withdraw from Afghanistan. It didn't last very long after that.
It was the Soviet Union's Vietnam.
Yes, yeah.
They got bogged down there, and it cost them enormously in credibility at home. They had terrible consequences in terms of deaths of their own troops and very great difficulty withdrawing. But America's policy generally on intervention has been so inconsistent. As I was saying, I think before you lost me,
yes,
President Obama's failure to intervene in Syria had phenomenally damaging consequences and damaged America's credibility as in intervention. So I think without the presence of at least the possibility of a military intervention, America is nowhere in this game. And the Chinese hegemony, which is definitely on the march and has serious intentions for sort of at least economic empire building, if not military empire building, can go unchecked.
Michael, both President Obama and therefore Biden was in the Obama administration, and now Joe Biden, both seem to believe that the US needs to tilt towards Asia Pacific, not the very least because of its concerns about China's hegemony, as Janet was saying. How will those countries it seeks to influence in the region, do you think, look at what has happened in Afghanistan and about the, however else you put it, relatively abrupt departure of the Americans?
Well, it's not relatively abrupt, and that's the first thing. And one hopes that the leaders of the Asia-Pacific region countries don't spend all day on Twitter, because that's nowhere to learn about the world. So I'm not too worried. I wanted to pick up the two things that both Janet and Vincent were saying, because in some ways they're related. One of the terrible things about American intervention over the last 30 years has been it's become just a little bit too much like other forms of American politics. In other words, we went into Iraq, that was a Bush administration thing, so now we're not going to stay there. That's Obama. But, we'll stay in Afghanistan because there is a very strong constituency within the Democratic Party on women's rights. And, we all would endorse that. But is the military the way to bring and guarantee those rights in perpetuity in a country like Afghanistan? Because women's rights are traduced in all manner of countries all over the world violently. So is the U.S. going to send its armies everywhere to protect women and make sure young girls can get educated? They're not. Vincent's point, what's interesting to me is I remember reading about one of the world's largest copper deposits is in Afghanistan. It's just south of Kabul. And the Chinese, for 15 years, have been trying to organize a mine there. And when I first read about it, I remember the article. It described, Chinese mining engineers going to visit the deposit past American soldiers. And I thought, my God, we're paying all this money to provide the security for our biggest economic rivals to go and dig up one of the great deposits of copper, one of those important raw materials on the face of the earth. Now the Chinese are, if they want that copper, by the way, the mine has never been open. I mean, they're still negotiating. We're negotiating with the last Afghan government. China will now have to make its own way in Afghanistan, and it's part of the Belt and Road. And I think it'll be very interesting to see. My own guess is that, the Chinese, as Janet was saying earlier, they're kind of capitalist totalitarian state. And if their relations with countries in Africa are anything to go by, they won't care about women's rights too much. They'll just want to be secure digging up the copper.
Yeah, I mean, interesting. If people want to know more about that mine, Isabel Hilton talked about it on this programme a few weeks ago. You find it on previous editions of Dateline on the BBC iPlayer. Vincent, I mean, we'll leave the women's rights issue. It's you can argue about whether the Americans helped to achieve something and then they're helping to undermine it, or whether it was never their problem in the first place. But we're talking about the reaction there. We've talked a lot about China. What about Russia and Iran? I mean, Iran is an Islamic republic, but it's an Islamic republic that's much more open for women. It's a different brand of Islam. It's Shia Islam. Presumably it's not comfortable with the way things are going in Afghanistan. And similarly, Russia has got concerns like the Chinese have about its own Muslim minorities, the Chechens.
Yeah, totally. I mean, Russia and Iran both are very worried about the security issue, right? I mean, as well as China. I'll go back to the copper mine later. But, Russia will also be constantly reminded of their own defeat in Afghanistan decades ago. It's actually, very short period of time ago, actually, if you look at the long history history of Afghanistan. But, Iran, they will certainly be interested in economic and security interests because ultimately Iran and Afghanistan traded actually quite heavily with each other. But at the same time, Iran will be very concerned about the influx of potential refugees.
And the stans as well, Turkmenistan.
Totally, absolutely.
And the others?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this hasty withdrawal by the United States will completely change the geopolitical landscape in the region. And maybe this is time of monsters, but maybe this is also time of the opportunity for countries to get things right.
I mean, the Economist magazine published an interesting article last week in which they said across Asia, democracies are under strain. They mentioned a report by the VDEM Institute at the University of Gothenburg, does an annual survey of the strength of democracy. It said India had gone from an elected democracy to a sort of elected autocracy. There are concerns about Indonesia. We've had companies like Myanmar and Thailand becoming effectively subject to military coups. I mean, is there a longer term issue here, do you think, about the viability of what, after all, started out as a Western model of multi-party democracy in a very different part of the world?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Sean. I think, yes, we are witnessing the rise of authoritarianism. Countries are being more transactional rather than ideas-driven. It's really difficult to say how the future, what the future holds for Asia in particular. It's hugely diverse. But what we are seeing now is another variable. It's like Pandora's box being opened in Afghanistan. We don't know how big powers are going to play. They are very cautious, but we are talking about this essentially just 1 week after U.S. withdrawal, yes. And history is much longer than that. So we'll have to wait and see how things will evolve. Now, going back to the copper mine issue, yes. Of course, China will talk up its Belt and Road, its economic benefits. But actually, if you look at the data, even before this withdrawal last year, according to China's own Commerce Ministry, yeah. China's investment, foreign direct investment in Afghanistan was only $4.4 million. Now, give you a bit of background.
Given the figures that were being quoted earlier about
absolutely,
American
there's a bit of a
British,
myth. Yeah.
Michael was mentioned.
Absolutely. There's a bit of a myth about Chinese investment in Afghanistan. Now, in comparison, in neighboring Pakistan, China's involvement last year, the foreign direct investment, was $110 million US. So you see the difference despite the rhetoric. But I think this rhetoric will also be very useful for China because China wants something in return. After all, the Wakhan Corridor was bordered with this region called Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region in China, and Beijing has long been concerned about the Islamic militants, Uyghur militants attacking Chinese mainland, and they certainly would want to tell the Taliban just not to provide shelter for them.
Let me just go back to Janet and Michael. Michael, Pakistan is an interesting example that Vince mentioned because you could say its relationship with the Taliban has been ambiguous, to say the least, and that has had consequences for America, which has regarded Pakistan as an important ally in the region. Should it be rethinking that relationship?
I think it should, and I hope it does, and I hope that journalists and historians get to work on trying to get to the core of the relationship between the Taliban and Pakistan. We've heard bits and pieces over more than 20 years, 25 years, 30 years to the creation of the Mujahideen when they were trying to get the Russians out of Afghanistan in the late 1980s. And it's an absolutely critical thing. And, I don't know if we'll have time to talk about refugees, but, many people will actually go into Pakistan. They'll never try to get to Europe. It's just too far. Many Afghans will try in Western Afghanistan, will go across as they did before into Iran. And, these two countries, I think it would bear the United States and European allies, whether through the EU or Britain, going it alone, examining what diplomacy over the next decade should be with Iran and Pakistan.
30 seconds or so, Janet, I'm afraid. Just your last thought.
The reason the Taliban are making what everybody thinks are phony statements about how respectable they're going to be is not just to appeal to America and to NATO. It's also to appeal to Russia and China. Russia and China both have their problems with Islamic minorities, and the Taliban are politically manipulative and sophisticated enough to know that. And they can be very useful to China and Russia, particularly China, with their supplies of copper and lithium.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. We've got some interference on your line, but we got your point. Vincent, 10 seconds or so. Last thought.
Well, I think we have to look at the internal dynamics in the Taliban-ruled Afghanistan as well. The Taliban might well end up fighting their own domestic insurgents, not just those who were sympathetic with the US, but also those who are more extreme.
Vincent Nee, Janet Daly and Michael Goldfarb, thank you all very much for being with us. Thank you too for joining us here on Dateline. Back same time next week. From all of us here, goodbye.